What happens when you die? This is a question that I've wondered about ever since I learned the concept of death in the first place. The first explanation that we've likely heard if we've grown up in the West, or a society with Abrahamic religions in general, is that you will go to heaven or hell. Your fate is determined by how you behave in this life. Even though I had an agnostic upbringing, the idea of going to hell for eternal damnation scared the ever-living shit out of me. Others believe that religions are full of shit, and that it's impossible to prove what happens to your consciousness when you die, or that nothing happens altogether because consciousness is a result of brain activity. Buddhists and Hindus claim that when we die, we reincarnate, and we either achieve a better or worse life based on the karma of our previous lives. The aim is to eventually liberate oneself from this world altogether into higher realms of existence, or nirvana, as Buddhists call it. This is achieved with dedicated spiritual practice. However, the vast majority of us are stuck on our ways, and so we're stuck here with each other. I guess that means that I'm going to be stuck here for my love of the Wendy's Baconator. Those who believe in reincarnation would assure us that we will experience all the things we loathe and love about reality billions upon billions of times. You may ask, why even care about what happens when we die? Shouldn't I just live how I want and wait till I get there? Sure, that's one strategy, pretty much the one that everybody takes by default. However, I think it is worth investigating because, as Tyler Durden says, one day you will die. And until you realize that, you are useless. And as Walter White from Breaking Bad says, every life begins with a death sentence. So it may behoove us as human beings to investigate what happens when this life ends. John McConnell was a retired New York police officer who worked as a security guard. One night after work, he went to an electronics store where he got into a shootout with 3 robbers. He was shot 6 times. One of the bullets went through his left lung, heart, and main pulmonary artery. He was taken to the hospital, but didn't survive. 5 years after John passed away, his daughter gave birth to her son William, who was diagnosed with pulmonary valve atresia, where the valve of the pulmonary artery hasn't formed properly. These defects are remarkably similar to the impact of the wounds experienced by his grandfather. William also started to describe his grandfather's life when he was old enough to speak. His mother asked if he knew anything from before he was born. He said that he died on a Thursday, spoke to God, telling him he was ready to come back, and was born on a Tuesday. This is true. His grandfather, or himself in a previous incarnation, died on a Thursday, and William was born on a Tuesday. William also said that there's not just heaven, but different levels. Animals are reborn, as well as humans. We can infer that all sentient beings reincarnate as well. William was a Roman Catholic, but believed in reincarnation, and that he would take care of animals in his next life. William said that he wanted to be an animal doctor when he grows up. In Western culture, the idea of research supporting reincarnation is strange to us. In mainstream culture, reincarnation is depicted as tapping into ancient life under hypnosis, or joking about what we did wrong in a past life to explain our current plight. In any case, reincarnation is a view that conflicts with materialist science as well as fundamentalist religion. If we want to investigate whether reincarnation is real, how do we go about doing it? Isn't the only way to know for sure is if we die? Well, that's certainly one way to find out, the inevitable way, but it's worth looking into because it can prepare us for what to expect and a context and orientation for while we're still alive. A person who has investigated past life cases is Ian Stevenson. Stevenson documented cases where the child has a birthmark at the same place as a wound of the previous life. In Reincarnation and Biology, he reports 225 cases. Cases are found in all continents except Antarctica, for obvious reasons. In Asia, cases are more common, whereas in the US, they are more sparse. But it is possible that they still occur here, but aren't as well documented due to religious dogma or the more skeptical attitude that reincarnation is just woo-woo nonsense. Stevenson would often work with translators in these cases to overcome language barriers. In past life cases, psychologists would meet after the case is solved, meaning the child gives detail to meet the family of their past incarnation. The subject's family is interviewed. Emphasis was placed on what the adults would say when the case started. Note was taken of the birthmark when the child was born. A list of statements the child made about their past life was recorded. The location of the wound of their previous incarnation through autopsies, police records, family members who saw the wound when preparing the body for the funeral. To qualify, a case has to meet at least two of the following. Specific prediction of rebirth, the kind of next parents, for instance. Announcing dream, birthmark or defect related to previous life, statements by child about previous life that are verified by parent. Subject can recognize people or objects familiar to previous personality. Unusual behavior related to previous personality. And finally, unusual behavior related to the previous personality. So, here's a few cases collected by Stevenson where birthmarks match the wounds of their past life. This is verified by medical records. On June 11, 1963, Ben Koybasi was born in Hatunköy, Turkey. His parents had dreams about a relative, Hasim Koybasi, that led them to believe their son was Hasim reincarnated, who was killed 5 months before in a riot. In the post-mortem report of Hasim, Stevenson found that the bullet which killed Hasim came back from the left ear and got stuck in the right side of the neck. A doctor had to make an incision to remove the bullet. The birthmark of Metin was the same spot where the bullet was extracted post-mortem. Metin even wanted to take vengeance on the man who shot him and tried to take his dad's gun to try and shoot him, but thankfully this was prevented. Metin also later became more peaceful over time. Nasruddin Shah was born in Pradesh, India in 1962 to a Muslim family. He had a lens-shaped birthmark on the left side of his chest, which his family didn't get the significance of until he started to speak of his previous life. Nasruddin claimed to be a Thakur, second highest Hindu caste. His name was Hardan Ben Singh and indicated that he was from Fargana, a nearby village. He claimed to have died during a dispute about cattle and was killed with a spear. These statements about Hardev Baksh Singh were verified. In fact, during the dispute, the spear went through his upper left chest. What's also peculiar is that even though Nasruddin's parents were Muslim, he believed that he was a Hindu and wouldn't go to mosque or take part in Islamic prayers. Although reincarnation isn't a part of their faith, his statements and behavior convinced his parents that he is in fact the reincarnation of Hardev Baksh Singh. So, isn't it possible that these cases are made up? And this is a fair question. There are cases where parents coach the kid to say that they saw heaven and bullshit on everyone on national television. However, in these cases, they were interviewed by researchers themselves. In the significant majority of cases, they would have no motivation to lie. That is, unless they were desperate for the attention of a psychiatrist and psychologist. There's also cases where one of the two parents isn't happy about the idea of claiming their child was a reincarnation of someone else from a past life for either skeptical, secular, or religious reasons. Another objection is that the investigators themselves committed fraud. They know they've met with the subjects, but how do we? Even if the significance of the investigators' findings is debated, the investigators recorded their field notes. Ian Stevenson also recorded the weaknesses as well as the strengths of the studies. What if the subjects are making it up? We know that kids can be imaginative. For instance, if a child remembers the name of the previous personality, maybe it's just luck or coincidence. However, Chapter 1 of Life After Life gives the example of Suzanne Guinnam, who was able to get not only one name correctly, but names of 25 people and the relation to their previous personality, only misnaming one. This is too precise to simply be disregarded as a coinkydink. If someone said, I was a man who died in California, obviously there's a lot of people who fit that description. However, these cases are much more precise. Another skeptical objection may be that this kind of information could be learned through more ordinary means, like overhearing a conversation about a deceased relative, and the child repeats it. However, it would be impossible for them to repeat details of deceased relatives who live many miles away by ordinary means. What if it's just faulty memory? The parents want to believe that their child is someone else reincarnated, and so they ask leading questions and frame what their kids blurt out to justify their woo-woo beliefs. This is easy to believe if you are a skeptic. However, the details the children provide lead the parents to find the family of the deceased, and the statements of the child match the details of their past life, such as names, places, and other substantial details. What about genetic memory? This is strange, but more compatible with mainstream medical thought. Perhaps knowledge of ancestral experience is transferred through the genes somehow. The problem with this is that there are cases where children have past life memories and are not genetically related to the deceased, or even have an entirely different cultural background. Perhaps if you're more into the paranormal, an explanation for these memories is that the children have ESP, or psychic powers. However, the vast majority of these children don't display any psychic abilities. A religious objection could be that they are possessed. This is also not likely, considering these seem like distant memories, and their personality does not drastically change. And finally, what about reincarnation? If someone really is their grandparent reincarnated, where does their consciousness go in the interim period? This will be addressed later. When does consciousness enter a new body? Why do some people have memories of past lives and most of us don't? If these cases are true, do we all reincarnate? So there's a few objections to the idea of reincarnation. The first is materialism. Materialists reject the notion that one's consciousness or awareness reincarnates to another body after passing because the physical world is all there is. In other words, when you're dead, you're dead. However, this scientific assumption is rather outdated. When you're dead is not scientifically proven, but is in fact an assumption. According to O. Costa de Beauregard, quote, "Far from being irrational, the paranormal is postulated by today's physics." In the same way that the smallest particles of the universe have a different set of rules than the larger worlds it composes, consciousness may have a different set of rules than the physical universe it observes. But what about population growth? If there are more humans on the earth living now than in the past, where did those souls come from? According to David Bishai of Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, since 50,000 BCE, there have been 105 billion human beings that have lived on the planet. By the end of the century, we're supposed to have 10 billion people on the planet. So if anything, by this logic, we would expect a cosmic DMV-style waiting line for people to reincarnate into physical bodies. Lastly are religious objections to the idea of reincarnation. This is more common in Western religions, since it is a central theme of spirituality and religion in the East. Those who are more fundamentalists believe we have this one life as a test to determine our eternal fate in heaven or hell. However, reincarnation may be more compatible than Western religions than you would initially think. In the Jewish Kabbalah, reincarnation is included. The Gnostic Christians believed in reincarnation. Christians in Southern Europe believed in reincarnation until 553 CE, where the idea of reincarnation was condemned. Shiite Muslims believe that you have a series of lives, and you go to heaven or hell based on the behavior of all of them. Imagine if you were just one life short of banging all those virgins and had to bend over for Satan for all of eternity instead. Reincarnation doesn't conflict with the idea of living an ethical, moral life in service of others. What are near-death experiences? And what do they tell us about the afterlife? Near-death experiences are where the subject is close to dying or clinically dead and reports an experience such as flying out of their body and going to heavenly realms and coming back to their physical body to report their experience. It should be of no surprise that as medical science has advanced to revive people, that we hear these kinds of reports from those who survived. Typically, they describe moving toward a bright light. They see deceased loved ones, relatives, and friends. Their lives are re-experienced like a hologram, and even experience their lives through the eyes of others, rather than their own. The way patients go back to their body differs. Some go straight from the white light back to their bodies, while others are told that they have to go back, or they've been given a choice about staying or going back. but usually decide to go back to their physical form for their family. The effect of an NDE makes the patient no longer fear death and pursue love and meaning rather than wealth or power. It's established that these experiences do in fact happen. However, there is debate about how and why they happen and what it means for our consciousness when we die. The more acceptable point of view of NDEs to mainstream science is that they are just chemicals in the brain causing us to hallucinate. So in reality, when you die, you die. Or we just don't know yet. The other point of view is that your consciousness is in fact leaving the physical body because there's no brain activity detected, and yet the patient is still having an experience. The consequence of this view being true is that there is in fact an afterlife. The flatline EEG argument seems appealing. However, there is subtle brain activity near death that the EEG cannot detect. It may be easy to dismiss NDEs as just hallucinations or in the brain. However, people report having out-of-body experiences where they have received information that they couldn't have gotten with ordinary senses. Dean Radin, PhD, argues that the experiments with telepathy may explain why people have experiences of floating out of their body and identifying objects in their surroundings. Jeffrey Long, MD, proposes 9 lines of evidence that NDEs are medically inexplicable. The first being that a coherent experience is happening while the patient is unconscious or clinically dead. This defies logic. How is it possible that someone who is unconscious or dead reports such a vivid experience? Line of evidence 2 is that people have out-of-body experiences. 45% of near-death experiencers report floating above their body and seeing their surroundings. To test this, Michael Sabom, MD, had a group of patients who had both had cardiac arrests and NDEs, and a group who had cardiac arrests but not NDEs. The test was to see who could describe their resuscitations more accurately. The test found that the group of people who had experienced NDEs were about to describe the resuscitations more accurately than the group who didn't experience NDEs. Line of evidence number 3 is that there are cases where blind from birth NDEers are able to see in their near-death experience, such as the study conducted by Kenneth Ring, PhD. Vision is also reported to be different from our daily lives, so it's unlikely that people see what they would expect in a life-threatening circumstance. Line of evidence 4, under anesthesia, it would be impossible to have any coherent experience. After reviewing 613 near-death experiences, Long found that 23 NDEs occurred while under general anesthesia. The most common life-threatening event associated with these was cardiac arrest. Long isn't the only one to find this. According to Bruce Grayson, MD, NDE researcher at the University of Virginia, quote, "In our collection of NDEs, 127 out of 578 NDE cases, or 22%, occurred under general anesthesia, and they included such features as out-of-body experiences that involved experiencers watching medical personnel working on their bodies, an unusually bright or vivid light, meeting deceased persons, and thoughts, memories, and sensations that were clearer than usual. If NDEs were just brain activity, they wouldn't be able to happen while under anesthesia." Line 5 is the life review, which occurred in 14% of Long's review of 617 NDEs. Life reviews are a review of a part or all of your life, typically from a third-person perspective. The life review also provides that perspective of yourself, but from the people around you. These suggest that the validity of NDEs due to their accuracy. Line 6 is the encounters with the deceased. A study by Emily Kelly, PhD, found that only 4% of NDEers encounters seeing people that are currently still alive. There are also cases where someone is in an NDE, sees someone that they think is currently alive, but had actually passed away. This disproves the notion that an NDE is formed by previous expectations. Line 7 is NDEs that occur in children 5 and younger. Despite their age, their experience is still similar to older children and adults. Line number 8 is the cross-cultural study of NDEs. In both Western and non-Western NDE reports, the narratives are more similar than dissimilar. This gives weight to the idea that NDEs are experienced independent of brain function, because if it were just occurring inside the brain, cultural differences would impact the experience. Line 9 of evidence is the after effects of near-death experience. Of 278 NDEs, 54.7% had large changes to their life, 25% had moderate changes, and 10% had slight changes. When comparing two groups, both experiencing cardiac arrest, but one with and one without the NDEs, the group with the NDEs were more likely to have a reduced fear of death, more love and empathy, and interest in the meaning of life. Of the 1,122 NDEs in an NDE-RF study, 95.6% claimed their experience was definitely real when asked about the reality of their experience. This evidence shows not only that NDEs are medically inexplicable, but of their reality as well. As a neurosurgeon, Ibn Alexander, author of Proof of Heaven, was taught that consciousness is created by the brain. From this perspective, everything can be reduced to the natural laws governing the behavior of atoms and molecules. So therefore, we have no free will. However, he points out that the only thing that truly exists in our own consciousness. Consciousness is fundamental to reality, and not an illusion created by the brain. The more we understand the physical workings of the brain, the more we realize it's not what creates consciousness. Alexander, among others, argues that we are actually conscious in spite of our brain, and that the brain acts as a filter reducing consciousness to the physical reality we perceive. He argues that terminal lucidity, elderly having clarity of their lives and perceiving loved ones taking them to the other side on the way out, and savant syndrome, some sort of trauma to the brain creating a savant, is proof for this. Perhaps consciousness is not located in our brain, but is in fact non-local, meaning that perhaps instead of our mind being in our body is in the mind of the universe. Quote, I maintain that the human mystery is incredibly demeaned by scientific reductionism, with its claim in promissory materialism to account eventually for all of the spiritual world in terms of patterns of neuronal activity. This belief must be classed as a superstition. We have to recognize that we are spiritual beings with souls existing in a spiritual world, as well as material beings with bodies and brains existing with souls existing in a spiritual world, as well as the material beings with bodies and brains existing in a material world. Sir John C. Eccles, Ph.D., neurophysiologist, Nobel Prize in Medicine and Physiology. NDEs challenge many beliefs we may have about consciousness or the nature of reality, for obvious reasons. From a purely materialist standpoint, it's easy to dismiss them as just hallucinations in the brain. However, no neuroscientist can point to where consciousness is generated. The so-called hard problem of consciousness becomes less hard when taking more into consideration than just the materialist dogmas. So-called skeptics value evidence, but believe NDEs are purely a result of brain activity. Despite the blind from birth having visions in NDEs occurring under general anesthesia, reports from different cultures reporting the same thing, and patients floating out of their body and identifying their surroundings more accurately than patients who didn't have an NDE. Proponents of physicalism believe anything mystical can be reduced to neurons firing in the brain, when in fact they can't pinpoint the exact mechanism that creates consciousness in the first place. And now we have the Tibetan Book of the Dead, if you're interested in the possibility of reincarnation. The question of whether or not consciousness continues after death has puzzled humanity's philosophers for thousands of years. To investigate this, we must define what a self is. According to Buddhism, a sense of self is the result of 5 parts: consciousness or awareness, form, our physical body and senses, feeling, thoughts and emotions, discrimination, and motivation. In other traditions, such as Christianity for instance, there is a soul or entity that is separate from the body. This is not the case in Buddhism, where the self is seen as a pattern of mental and physical attributes. The sense of self is actually a fiction given to a collection of these attributes. If the Buddhists believe that you don't have a soul, then how do you reincarnate? Their explanation is that nothing exists independent of other factors. For instance, the weather of today is distinct from yesterday's. but the previous does have an effect on the current. Our past actions have an effect on our current circumstances. Our karmic patterns of previous lives affect our current life and future lives. And this reincarnation poses as a problem because we keep reincarnating into this material world. The goal in Buddhism is to awaken from the suffering of this illusory existence to liberation. If someone dies in their previous life, deteriorating of old age or illness, it is likely that the memories are lost. Perhaps this explains the memories of the previous cases where people are killed and the memory is transferred to their next life, and why these memories are strongest in the early stages of rebirth. So what does it mean to be dead? Our Western scientific view tells us that a person is dead when they've flatlined, and there is no more activity in the brain. By arguing that when we die we become nothingness, this is still a conceptual error. It is in essence believing that you will be in a permanent state of unconscious rest, hence the term rest in peace. There is no direct experience or recordings used to report going into nothingness. So the idea of when you die, is just dogma. There are, however, reports of near-death experiences and past life memories which suggest that reincarnation is a viable explanation for when we die, as we've just covered. So, what does the Tibetan Book of the Dead say about the process of death? Once you are clinically dead, your consciousness moves inward and perceives a sky full of white moonlight, then an orange sunlight, then pure darkness. Then you lose consciousness. Then a clear, transparent light with a non-dual quality to it. This is where death really occurs, and where we transition from one life to the next. For most of us, we are unconscious and confused, and so we go backwards from the stages of death and reincarnate into a physical body. Meditation, rituals, and prayers are used to prepare the mind for death, so that way one can become liberated or have a more desirable incarnation. So your physical body is dead, and your consciousness is going on to the next place. The idea of this kind of freaks me out. I mean, the transition from the last moments of your life to not breathing but still perceiving, and then into whatever comes next is quite terrifying. This period from dying to leaving your body is said to be as long as eating a meal. Hopefully the Lord of Death isn't having a all-you-can-eat buffet. In this state, it is recommended to not cling to attachments of your previous life, because you no longer own them anyways. You do not want to be in a state of resentment when you die, but instead a state of generosity. It is critical to go out with grace and a positive outlook. For the vast majority of us, it is likely that we'll still be in this realm for a few more incarnations. You may wonder how you find a fortunate incarnation for the next life. Quote, "In thus choosing the womb door, there is always danger of erring. Under the influence of evolution, you might see an excellent womb door as bad. You might see a bad womb door as excellent. So here the key instruction for choosing is important. Do as follows. Even if a womb door appears to be excellent, do not become attached to it. Even if it appears bad, do not become averse to it. Enter it within the experience of the universal loving equanimity, free of lust and hate and compulsive choosing between good and bad. This is the authentic, profound key instruction. The key is for the between being to enter her womb without coming under the heavy influence of the emotional addictions, lust, hate, or delusion. This is important in order to remain alert to the true nature of the place, and not making the worse than fatal error of taking rebirth in a horrid life form. The Tibetan Book of the Dead also has a great deal of rituals and preparations for those who are dying. I recommend giving it a read if that is something that you are interested in the future. That concludes today's episode. I am Parker Tebow of Focus Shift Media. Feel free to hit like, subscribe, and share with a friend. It helps the channel. And if you run a platform, or you're a content creator, you run a business and are in need of any video editing or graphic work, our services are available at www.focusshiftmedia.net. Thank you for watching, and stay groovy.